Okay, good morning or afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to give a slightly different kind of talk than we've heard this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about what are megaregions and the challenges of governing megaregions, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that we might differently conceptualize the challenge of governance. So it may be a little bit out there, but I hope to get some good feedback from all of you on it. Okay, I'm talking about rethinking governance. This is where we're located in Arlington. Actually, we'll be there in a couple of months. We're going to be on the 6th floor, so if you count up, that's where our school will be. This is in Arlington, right across the bridge from Washington, D.C., in the heart of Jay's County there. And also in the heart of an emergent megaregion, one of 10 or 11 emergent megaregions in the United States. And I say 10 or 11, different centers have different ways of measuring and identifying megaregions. So this particular map that I have here has 10 megaregions on it, but there's another one that runs along the Gulf Coast that others have identified as a megaregion as well. But we'll get there in a moment. So Washington, D.C. is at the heart of one of these megaregions that runs up the East Coast, up to Boston, and down to Richmond. So what is a megaregion? A megaregion is a new scale of geography. It's defined by layers of relationships that together define a common interest. And this common interest in turn forms the basis for policy decisions. And there are 5 categories or characteristics of megaregions that have been identified. One is that they share environmental systems and topography. They share infrastructure systems, economic linkages, settlement patterns and land use, and a shared culture and history. This group, America 2050, is part of the Regional Plan Association. It's a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to thinking regionally in planning efforts. And America 2050 has a board of advisors of a lot of leaders like Jay and Clay, but also academics who are interested in this topic as well. So a call for megaregional governance. There's a real expressed urgency that we've heard on many occasions during this conference to govern more broadly across jurisdictions in the U.S. around emerging megaregions, to address infrastructure, to address economic competitiveness, to address emergency management, population growth, these things. The question is, can we govern at a megaregion level? Do we have the capacity to govern at a megaregion level, whether here in the United States or in China? What does it take to do that? And what are the challenges? What are the questions that we have about it? And then I'll end by thinking about this idea of inclusion as a governing alternative, or a different way to think about governance. So, governance. Matthias Fleischer and others have defined it as organized efforts to manage the course of events in a social system. So how we make decisions about what we're going to do, right? A more generalized term than government, because it involves players other than just government. And the 2050 Association has said there's a greater impetus to coordinate policy at this expanded scale. So thinking about governance at the megaregion scale. So here's the governing challenge. There are many interdependent systems strained by growth and with a limited capacity for coordination. So I want to look at some of those areas or those challenges in a little bit more depth. So first of all, there's the priority of economic growth and activity. If you look across the megaregions in the United States, the 10 largest megaregions, 7 of which have populations of more than 10 million, they represent 80% of the U.S. economic activity, right, in just 10 megaregions. And our competitors in Asia, China here, Europe, are creating global integration zones by linking specialized economic functions across vast geographic areas, national boundaries with high-speed rail, and separated goods and movement systems. So this is from America 2050. And I highlighted two here. One is the Texas Triangle, which Jay is very familiar with, Austin, Dallas, and Houston, and it's growing very rapidly. By 2050, it will increase by 93% of its population size. And the other here is the Macau and Hong Kong zone here in China, known as the Hong Kong-Macau Greater Bay Area, has been growing rapidly for a long time, one of the largest one of the largest metropolitan regional growth areas in the world, highly integrated, highly coordinated. So very different from what we're seeing in the United States in terms of infrastructure and rail systems. There's also the stress of population concentration in megaregions. As I noted, by 2050, based upon population growth projections, 80% or more people in the US will live in one of 10 megaregions. Some projections are even as high as 90% of the US, leaving very few people in between, right? The Northeast Corridor, currently 53 million people. This is where we are in Washington, D.C. 17% of the US population is there and projected to grow by another 35% by 2050. And this chart here, which you can strain your eyes to see, just gives some percentages of other megaregions and how much they're anticipated to grow over the next several years. There's also the complexity of multiple jurisdictions. Jay talked about this today. In the Washington, D.C. metro area alone, there's 24 local governments, the Maryland and Virginia state legislatures, the U.S. Congress. This map up here on the top is actually of New York with some Pennsylvania counties, New Jersey counties as well. It's the New York metro region. It has 3 states, 31 counties, 783 municipalities, 703 school districts, 105 housing authorities, 459 fire districts. You get the idea, right? A lot of coordination that needs to take. And these are small scale. They're not entire megaregions. So there's a real complexity of multiple jurisdictions that we're dealing with here as well. There's also the danger and loss of capacity through aging infrastructure. This cartoon here from the Ledger says, well, we may not be able to drive, we won't have to pay a gas tax, right? But the point is that maybe if we could pay a gas tax, we'd be able to drive on our roads and bridges and highways. So this is a quote from a piece in Planetizen that said, while crumbling infrastructure is not necessarily a new problem for cities, continued growth will create a greater reliance on these interconnecting systems that are just failing. They are literally crumbling in many places. The American Society of Civil Engineers, their annual report card in 2017 for infrastructure of all kinds, airports, railroad, roads, bridges, water systems, D+ for the United States. That's not good. I don't know what a D+ stands for in China, but in the US, a D+ is not good. So. All right, and there's also economic disparities and social equity. So this graphic here is from the Haas Institute at Berkeley, showing the continued share of national income that's going to the top 1% of earners. It's just a huge disparity. And there's this really thoughtful article that Benner and Pastor wrote in Urban Affairs Review back in 2011, where they ask these specific questions. They say, so if we're going to plan at a regional level, at a mega-region level, is this the level at which significant problems of inequality are being caused? Is this the level at which problems of inequality can be effectively addressed via new policy? And is this the level at which the politics of coalitions for equity can be organized and sustained? So they're asking, is this really the right level of governance to address the kind of really serious economic inequality issues and challenges that we have? And I think this is a really important question. We get so focused on what we want to do with economic growth and what we want to do with integration that there are multiple questions of alternative governance that may not be addressed if we're thinking about that level. And then finally, there's managing the environment and climate change. So, this past couple of months, we've had terrible, devastating fires all across California. Houston suffered, as Clay knows very well, directly a terrible flood from a hurricane, drought in other parts of the world. So planning and policy making at the megaregion level could perhaps better focus attention on climate change and the vulnerability of the environment. But the question is, how does governance at the megaregion level impact our efforts to plan and prepare for climate change and the implications for migration, natural disasters, and more? I think the inclination is that it will help us a lot to be able to do something at a broader regional level, but it'd be different. We'd have to think about how we do that. So there's a failure of interdependent systems of governance that can be seen in multiple crises in the United States and across the world over the past 2 decades. At Virginia Tech, we're very familiar with the Flint water crisis. Flint, Michigan is a town that's been devastated by the loss of jobs and income base and tax base over the many years. It's a predominantly African-American community, and the water systems are failing miserably there. And over the course of several years, there were decisions made about alternative sources of water for Flint, but decisions were not made about treating the water to prevent the corrosion of lead. And so literally thousands of people in Flint were poisoned by lead water over the series of a couple of years. And one of our colleagues at Virginia Tech, Mark Edwards, who's an engineer, led the effort to document this and to document the lead poisoning in the water and to hold people accountable for what happened. But it was a massive crisis. It was a health crisis. It was an infrastructure crisis. It was a financial crisis. All types of interdependent systems failed and failed the people of Flint miserably. Our response to Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 and some of the more recent storms in Puerto Rico show an inability to coordinate across infrastructures and across systems as well. And then there's the financial crisis of 2007, a regulatory failure across housing, across multiple financial systems, and across multiple countries as well. Don Kettle is a public administration scholar. Those of you in the School of Government probably know Don Kettle. And he says, the current conduct of American government is a poor match for the problems it must solve. In other words, the problems are wicked problems. They are complex, they are deep, they are layered, they are huge and significant, but our systems of government are just not up to the task. Our systems of government are not able to collaborate and to address them on the scale that they need to be addressed on. So here's the Megaregion governance challenge. Our systems of governance are strained, and in some cases they are broken. The Megaregion focus provides a really interesting alternative to frame these challenges that we face. It provides a focus on economic competitiveness, quality of life, economic opportunity, the possibility of a more integrated management of the environment, emergency response, and more. As Jay pointed out in his presentation, maybe this a vision for the region could help drive some of this change and make us be more effective. But I'm going to ask, is the Megaregion the right framework for addressing these problems? And do some issues get overlooked at the Megaregion level? And do we have the right conceptual framework for governing or coordinating at the Megaregion level? We saw in some of the earlier slides the questions that people are asking about economic inequality and others as well. I think before we rush in and embrace the Megaregion as the next layer of governance and the next approach, we should think about some of these things. And we should think about whether or not we have the capacity to address them at that level as well, or what it might take. In public administration over the last many decades, coordination has been all the rage, right? We've been trying to figure out how do we coordinate across government agencies, and how we coordinate when and how do we sustain it. So we've gone from talking about government to governance, which is all about coordination. We've talked about boundary spanning and about bridging. We've talked about connecting the dots. After 9/11, the idea was how do you connect the dots so that you don't lose information. We've talked about contingent coordination, the ability of organizations to come together contingently to coordinate in the event of an emergency. We use the term networks. We've talked about the third way. We've talked about co-production, cross-sector collaboration, right? No matter what we call it, it doesn't get any easier, and we still struggle to try to do it. So what do we know about coordination and Megaregion governance in the U.S.? We know that these regions are highly fragmented, and they require significant alignment and coordination. We know that councils of government and metropolitan planning organizations vary in the breadth of their responsibilities and the authorities and their ability to coordinate. We know that in some instances, self-organizing and informal efforts over time can be effective. Right? There's a great study by Ennis et al. That looks at the evolution of a governing network that happened in a very informal, collaborative kind of way over the period of a decade or so. We know that MPOs and departments of transportation collaborate frequently, but informality makes leadership oftentimes confusing. It's not always clear where decisions will be made and how things get finalized. And local governments and organizations often compete against each other. We heard that this morning as well. So this got me thinking about this idea of resilience as a form of governance and trying to build a capacity to govern. This is a quote by Anderson. It says, "The most important role for public managers is bringing citizens and policymakers to a practical understanding of the consequences and implementation challenges of policy proposals. Resilient governance must accept value diversity," so all kinds of different perspectives, while struggling to locate common ground. So I think of this as a definition of what resilient governance would look like. An alternative conceptual approach to regional or resilient governance. So we've talked about inclusion a lot in this conference, and in the case of the Chinese government incorporating inclusion in more urban planning. I use the term inclusion in a similar way, but I also use it in a kind of theoretical way. So my colleague Martha Feldman and I have written about inclusive management for a number of years. And we refer to inclusive management not only as an effort to be inclusive and to bring more people into the process, but there are certain theoretical trademark ideas about inclusion that I want to talk about because it makes us think differently about governance. So inclusive management is a way of practicing and enacting governance that focuses attention on connections that managers make across zones of difference or boundaries, and the potential for management practices to alter the way that issues, power, and participants are constituted, right, the way we see ourselves, through decision-making and implementation processes. It is a relational understanding of governance. And let me take 4 minutes to try to explain what I mean by that. All right, so first of all, it's a conceptual way to think about governance. The inclusive approach gets us thinking about governance as something that is emergent, that is enacted, and that there's a reciprocal relationship between action and structure. So oftentimes we think change might come by reorganizing things, or we think change might come from a very dynamic leader. And the inclusive management approach is you have to look at both. It's a continuous dynamic process. Structures influence agency, agency influences structure. It's an ongoing dynamic process. In one of our presentations this morning, we heard about the dynamic nature of space. Governance is the same way. Governance is dynamic. It's not a set, standard, static system. It's a dynamic system. The relational and informational work of public managers, planners, politicians, this is what produces governing structures. So I'm going to argue that a governance structure is not a structure because we write it on paper or say it's in law. It's a governance structure because we enact it, because we do something about it, right? Because we build relationships and we take action and we do things together. So therefore it's emergent. Another aspect of inclusive management is to do away with dichotomies, or not to recognize dichotomies. Those of you who are government students are familiar with the politics versus administration dichotomy, right? The idea that politics is one thing, administration is neutral. Or that if you have control, you can't have flexibility. Or if you have public participation, you lose efficiency. Or if we plan in a centralized way or a decentralized way. Or if we have an integrated economic system or a non-integrated economic system, right? Dichotomies are too often taken for granted when they should be questioned, and trade-offs are too often accepted when there may be ways to avoid them. So another aspect of this is to not utilize dichotomies when we're talking about governance. Another aspect of inclusive management is using the concept of ways of knowing as opposed to preferences. In economic theory, we're all familiar with the idea that we have preferences, right? That, I prefer, white rice and chicken to, ham and eggs, for example, right? That we all have these priorities and preferences that we can rank, and we'll pay differently for different things depending upon what our preferences are. But a way of knowing suggests that what we prefer or what we identify with is something that emerges through our experience and through our knowing of different people, information, and things. So a way of knowing is an emergent way of understanding the world around us that's not necessarily defined by some internal preference that we have. And it suggests that we're open to change, right? It suggests that there's different ways of knowing circumstances. So climate change, we can know climate change one way, we can know climate change another way. We can believe in it or we can't. Ways of knowing would say it's not about our preference or our clear understanding. It's about our way of knowing that, right? How do we get the knowledge? Who do we engage with? How have we learned about it over time? How have we experienced it? 1 minute. Okay. Inclusive management is also, it takes an approach that governance is ongoing and continuous, that we're continuously navigating zones of difference, the political, the experiential, the technical, and the jurisdictional, and that we're continuously navigating the ways of knowing and ambiguity. So it understands ambiguity as when we reach a point of crisis, we reach a point of calamity, our way of knowing the world has perhaps fallen away. We reach ambiguity, there's a need to come back together to a way of knowing. Crisis is the upending way of a way of knowing. Resilience is about the restoration of knowing. So regardless of the scale, size, money, et cetera, that's at stake, the issues of governance come down to navigating zones of difference and establishing new ways of knowing to move forward, recover, or to stay in place. And our governing challenges for moving and deciding, like a region or a megaregion, are structural, individual, jurisdictional, but the governing obstacles are fundamentally relational. And I'm wondering if this way of knowing governance is a means to navigate and inform the megaregion governing challenge, as opposed to thinking about it in merely structural terms, as we've been doing as well. So that was a race through, but I made it on time. Okay, thank you all.